I want to start by acknowledging country. I want to acknowledge the many countries that have been put in this chat. Um, usually acknowledgement of country is actually standing on, we're all standing together in one country. So it's a different way of doing it when you have to do this Zoom COVID world now, where we are going to acknowledge all the countries that we are sitting on. We're acknowledging the ancestors, the lands that they come from. But also what drives me is that we are leaders within the space of education, but we also are hopefully doing the right thing by our youth to create leaders for the future. So ATSIMA is striving to make sure that mathematics is, that all Indigenous students are successful at maths. But as part of that is to actually teach innovation within that space as well. So that we can create futures so they can create futures for themselves as well, and not just rely on what's out there. So I acknowledge all country and all ancestors, and I acknowledge the future leaders of our country. This webinar series has actually eventuated out of not being able to run our 2020 conference at Yirrkala community. The theme of that conference was Ni Wanana, Ni Jamamira Yangana, and that means speak it and you create it. And I'm hoping I've done some justice to the pronunciation there. The whole thing around that, way we planned that, is that we need to maintain diversity of language if we're going to maintain diversity of ideas. And education, particularly up at Arnhem Land, and which has filtered out to other communities, is this two-way learning. So the metaphor they use up at Yirrkala, which comes from the country at Brang Brang, is the idea of salt water and fresh water coming together. So the salt water and fresh water coming together, the salt water meaning the knowledge that come from overseas, the Western knowledge, the salt water meaning the Yolngu knowledge or Aboriginal knowledge of this country. And they come together at a special place called at Brang Brang, where they actually create a whirlpool where they exist together. So what they do is they respect each other in that space, but from that understanding and connections, they create life. And there's many, many ways of creating life at that interface between salt water and fresh water. So the life that we're creating here is new ideas, the way to teach mathematics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So these talks have actually been, put together on that sort of spectrum. And it is a spectrum because part of that metaphor is the notion of ebb and flow between salt water and fresh water. So as we create new ways of teaching, we are reminded of moving between those two worlds. So what you will hopefully see through these two talks by Siemon and by Nicole is that we will you'll see how where they're situated between that salt water, fresh water, and how both of them will position themselves within that space as well. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker. And sorry, excuse me, but I've lost my speaker's notes. Our first speaker is going to be Siemon from RMIT University. Di is an emeritus professor of mathematics education at the university, at RMIT University. Di has been a teacher, educator and researcher for over 40 years and remains actively involved in the professional development of teachers of mathematics. Her primary interest is in the provision of evidence-based formative assessment materials that can be used to identify and respond to where learners are in relation to their key ideas that make a difference, so that all learners have an opportunity to participate and succeed in school mathematics. Di has been associated with Maths Education Northern Territory for well over 20 years, first as a member of the Maths Teaching, Learning and Assessment Project, then as the researcher supporting the Sustaining Indigenous Students Achievement in Numeracy Project. From 2006 to 2009, Di was the director of the Building Community Capital to support sustainable numeracy education in remote locations linkage project, which together with John Bradbury and the NT Department of Education and Training resulted in the Talking Number resources. Di is passionately committed to the use of first language in the teaching and learning of mathematics in early years. Now, before I hand over to Di, I just want to remind you that we will have a Q&A after each talk. So don't use the chat. In the Q&A panel, please put your questions. and Katie Morris will curate those. We won't be able to get to all of them during the talk, during afterwards, but we'll promise to get to your questions via email afterwards, so we can save all them and we'll respond to those. So I'd like to now hand over to Di. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm hoping you can see my screen. Perhaps, Kirsty, you can just nod so that I know it's up there. Thank you. I'm speaking from my home in Melbourne, which is located on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. I'd like to thank ATSIMA for the opportunity and acknowledge the many, many people in the Northern Territory who have helped me over the years to see what is involved, and I mean see what is involved in the teaching and learning of school mathematics in those remote Indigenous communities. For the 2020, now 21 conference, Chris invited me to talk about best practice in mathematics education and how this might be realised for Yolngu and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In this online session, I'll focus on just one aspect of this very challenging task, and that is that effective teachers of mathematics pay attention to what students already know and use that to help them make connections to important mathematical ideas. That is, they don't waste children's time. Before we begin though, an important first step, and I'll say more about this at the conference next year, is to recognise that both best practice and mathematics are bound by culture, language and place. All cultural traditions find connecting patterns and apparent symmetries throughout nature. Individually and collectively, we accept these patterns as part of the background of our lives, beyond question or doubt. In other words, there's no universal mathematics. There are many ways of understanding the world, and what we know as school mathematics or Western mathematics is just one of those ways. Some years back, Alan Bishop made a case for distinguishing between mathematics with an uppercase M and mathematics with a lowercase m. This distinction was made not to privilege one form of mathematics over another or to assert that they're necessarily discrete, but to emphasise that mathematics is a cultural phenomenon, a way of knowing that prompts different ways of counting, locating, playing, designing and measuring in different cultures over time. I'll say more about the diversity of mathematics at the conference next year, but for now I intend to focus on what Bishop referred to as the mathematics of schooling, mathematics with a capital M. School mathematics has its origins in societies that were concerned with quantifying the world around them. While this mathematics was and is concerned with patterns and relationships, the focus, especially in the early years of schooling, is on number and on the comparison of attributes such as length. That is, with determining how many and how much, as can be seen from those content descriptors from the Australian curriculum. It's abundantly clear from international and national data and our own research in so-called mainstream schools that while school mathematics is serving some Australian students well, it is certainly not serving all Australian students well. This is not just an issue for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We can and should be doing better as a nation. And that requires a deeper understanding of what is involved in teaching and learning school mathematics in different cultural contexts. Yolngu parents and elders want their children to succeed at school. They want them to have the same opportunities as non-Indigenous students, but not at the expense of their own cultural practices, language and identity. Yolngu students are just as capable of learning school mathematics as non-Indigenous students, but schools are not supporting them to progress at the same rate. Excellence in teaching is the single most powerful influence on student achievement. But what does this mean in this context? Best practice, of course, is a highly contested notion. What is best educational practice in one cultural context is not necessarily best practice in another, where cultural norms and expectations about social behaviour are different. A case in point is the expectation that students will share their thinking with others in a process aimed at negotiating meaning. For our purposes here, however, it is generally agreed that effective teachers of mathematics identify and build on what students know in relation to important mathematical ideas and pay attention to connections between different aspects and representations of mathematics, and importantly, to the lived experience of students. Something that I came to appreciate much more as a result of participating in community events. Sitting with my sister at a ceremony similar to the one shown in this picture, I observed as she explained the significance and meaning of some of the songs and dances. I sat there for a long time, absorbed in the collective intensity and sense of purpose. Children of all ages participated. Some of the older children were invited to participate by gesture or by name, while toddlers joined in of their own volition. Older teenagers and adults were clearly concerned to perform well as they possibly could. Those who were seen to have performed well were acknowledged, and dancers would relocate to position themselves closer to someone who was seen to be doing the dance well. Older children might be mildly scolded for not performing as well as might be expected. No particular attention was paid to the younger children, although a good rendition of a particular movement was noted and rewarded with a smile or a gesture. This experience left a lasting impression on me and was a catalyst in helping me see school mathematics in a remote Indigenous community through different eyes. In particular, it helped me understand that learning and understanding are deeply connected to what is valued. We understand something when we can relate it to other things we know and value, something Marata Damaranch referred to as mingumir, to hold precious. This photo was taken at a community workshop. Yolngu community members were preparing as part of the project, the Building Community Capital project. The Yolngu community members were preparing to share their knowledge of Rulu with the Balanda teachers. Rulu is the name given to a collection of 5 turtle eggs, usually stacked with 4 on the bottom and 1 on the top. And this is used as a unit when distributing larger collections of turtle eggs. There's a growing body of evidence to suggest that where cultural knowledge is valued and employed in the pursuit of school mathematics education, Indigenous participants are far more likely to succeed. However, connecting cultural knowledge to school mathematics is a highly complex task that involves extensive collaboration, time, mutual respect, and significant knowledge of both ways of knowing. More about this next time. Suffice to say, it goes well beyond rewriting school mathematics word problems into Aboriginal contexts, but more about that, as I said, next year. So the point of this slide then is valuing and connecting cultural knowledge to school mathematics, and this is clearly where the language associated with Rulu and what we know as Western numbers was being established, and this nicely speaks to the conference theme, which I'll risk pronouncing as Niwagana Jama Miri Yagana. You speak it, you create it. So what is valued in school mathematics? This all led me to, as I said, for far too many students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, the emphasis is on basic skills at the expense of building deep, well-connected understanding of mathematics. One of the many reasons for this, and there are many, is that everything in the curriculum is treated as if it's as equally important. It's not, as I have learned from my many years as a teacher and researcher. This led me to this key question: what is it without which a student's progress in school mathematics will be seriously impacted? To me, the answer is some very big ideas in number, which need to be in place by certain points in schooling to ensure all students have the opportunity to learn mathematics well. For instance, by the end of the first 18 months or so of schooling, students need to trust the count. And this involves much more than being able to recite the number naming sequence or match numerals to collections, which is what's in the curriculum. It involves the creation of mental objects for the numbers to 10, which can be used as a basis for all other work with number. To illustrate this, if I asked you to imagine 2 dot dice, the sum of which is 8. I'm sure that all of you in your mind's eye can see perhaps a 5 and a 3, or a 4 and a 4, or a 6 and a 2. And I'll come back to this important big idea later. The big idea of place value, or the initial idea that 10 of these is one of those, needs to be in place around about the end of year 2. This is in line with curriculum expectations, but the complexity of this is rarely realised. As a result, many much older students and adults think of larger numbers simply as collections of ones. By the end of year 4 or thereabouts, students need to have moved from thinking about multiplication or as repeated addition to thinking about multiplication in terms of times as many as, or for each. This is not all there is to multiplicative thinking, but it's an important first step. By the end of primary school, students need to have acquired the big idea of partitioning. That is, the idea that any line segment, for example, can be broken up into any number of equal parts. This important multiplicative idea underpins all further work with fractions, decimals, and percent. By the end of year 8 or so, it's the critically important big idea of proportional reasoning that needs to be in place to support other work. And by year 10, it's the big idea of generalising. I don't have time, of course, to expand further, but it's important to note that these year levels are not locked in sand, and it's not when we start teaching and exploring these ideas. They all have their origins in the very first years of schooling. It is when they are located where they are because it's when they need to be in place to support what follows. If they're not in place by these key stages of schooling, we are putting students at risk of failing and not being able to participate in school mathematics. I'm going to focus now on just one of these big ideas and to try to illustrate how we made some connections between valued community knowledge, language, and school mathematics. So trusting the count is evident when children know that counting is an appropriate response to questions that ask how many, and they believe that counting the same collection again will always produce the same result, irrespective of how the objects in the collection are changed or manipulated. This requires a knowledge of the number naming sequence and the capacity to match number names to objects on a one-to-one basis. However, much more is needed before children can be truly said to trust the count. They need to be able to recognise collections to 10 without counting. This is known as subitizing, and it's based entirely on visual recognition, and many Indigenous students have a great facility in this regard. They need to have access to or build mental objects on the basis of those visual representations for each of the numbers to 10, which they can use without having to represent or count or see those collections physically. This is called part-whole knowledge, and I'll illustrate it again a bit later. They need to be able to demonstrate a sense of numbers beyond 10, for example, as 1, 10 and 4 more 14, rather than a count of every number up to 14. And very importantly, they be able to use small collections as units when counting larger collections. Now, this is known as recognising collections as what we call composite units, and it is critically important in building further mathematics ideas. Okay, and I said evidence of that perhaps can be seen in the use of Rulu we saw earlier to count turtle eggs. An important premise that underpinned the Building Community Capital project at Shepparton College on Elcho Island between 2006 and 2009, in fact we drifted into 2010 and 2011 as well, was that learning is enhanced when teachers pay attention to the knowledge and beliefs that learners bring to the learning task. Use this knowledge as a starting point for new instruction and monitor students' changing conceptions as instructions proceeds. The photo of turtle eggs and the plastic container with the ping pong ball shows how the idea of Rulu was used in the context of school mathematics at Elcho to build that very important notion of a composite unit. A number of what we call probe tasks were developed and used in the Building Community Capital project to identify what knowledge young students were bringing to the task of learning school mathematics. Typically, the probe tasks are short, performance-based tasks. They're based on research, and they're focused on a key aspect of primary mathematics, such as place value, for example. They do not require children to speak, read, or write in English, although they can if they wish. They make use of concrete materials or cards, and they support inferences about children's understanding of a particular aspect of one of those big ideas. The tasks were discussed in study groups involving Yolngu educators, referred to as teacher assistants by the Northern Territory Department, 1 or 2 teachers at the school, and 2 or 3 members of the research team. We met on a regular basis. The tasks were translated into Yolngu Mata with the help of a linguist and rehearsed in the study group before being used in the classroom by the Yolngu educators. The example shown here illustrates one of the probe tasks for place value. It required students to place the numbers 48, 67, then 26 on a 0 to 100 rope, one at a time. While this student has proceeded from left to right, other students confidently placed the 48 in the middle, the 67 less than halfway between the 48 and the 100, and the 26 roughly halfway between the 0 and 48, demonstrating a quite sophisticated understanding of the number line and, in fact, proportional reasoning. So this is an example of one of those early tasks. It's referred to as the subitizing probe task. It involved a series of subitizing cards, dot cards. They're shown to each child for approximately 2 seconds. And there's quite a collection of these. And if over all these cards the child recognises collections less than or equal to 5, then that suggests that pretty strongly that they can subitize numbers up to 5, and then that presents us with a starting point for teaching. On the other hand, if we look at response C, the child recognises most, if not all, the collections relatively quickly, and this could be in Yolngu Mata or in English. It suggests that the child has a developing understanding of numbers to 10 and beyond, and again, that points to a different starting point for teaching. This is another one of those tasks, and this is the beginning counting probe task, and it was designed to assess the extent to which students had developed mental objects, in this case for 9. They're told that there's 5 counters here and there are 4 more hidden, how many altogether? And it's not an addition task so much as an understanding of 9-ness task. If the child only counts what they can see, then they clearly have not really developed that mental imagery for a 4 that they can then work with in collaboration with the 5. And again, we get different responses up to a C, which says the child says 9 straight away, and they might do that for different reasons. For instance, because one child said to us, well, you said 4, and I know that 5 and 5 is 10, so it must be 9. And others say that I just see it in my head. And each of these responses, of course, indicate a specific starting point for teaching. And we then, in our study groups, of course, worked on what those points were and developed a range of activities. And this just gives you a little bit of an idea of the sorts of activities we used in the classroom to bring that cultural knowledge into the classroom and to help students relate to counting names that they knew in Yolngu Matas. So Gong Wangani, Ongang, for hand, and then of course we can talk about the idea of 2 hands, marama, gong marama, and we can talk about, for instance, the idea of lurken rulu, meaning 3 5s. Now, that's actually a really important notion, and again goes back to that composite unit, but that actually underpins multiplicative thinking and place value, and it's really, really important. Something to build on that makes sense to these students. I can't go without sharing. This is Rose Gowanga's book of numbers. She was trained as a teacher many years ago in the mission days, and this was her beautiful way of drawing attention to the fact that Yolngu had perfectly adequate ways of dealing with quite large numbers. But what's really lovely here is the way people have been used to count 20s, rulu have been used to count 5s, and to eggs or mapu have been used to count 1s. The work to connect cultural knowledge to school mathematics is ongoing, and John Bradbury will have much more to say about that in relation to place value and multiplicative thinking at next year's conference. The initial probe tasks prompted activity and rich discussions in Yolngu Mata about some very important ideas, and this is an example of just one of them. And I'm running out of time, so I won't have time to tell you another lovely story, but I will just finish with this. Bak Bak Maram, if you like, was we were able to, if you like, develop scripts which could be used in classrooms to develop a knowledge of numbers to 10 in terms of their parts based on visual recognition. So the teacher would show various representations, say 6, and students would respond by saying 6, and the young educator would ask 6 Billy, which loosely translates, how is it 6? And the students would respond 6 Billy, 3 ga 3, meaning it's 6 because I see 3 and 5, or 6 Billy, 4 ga 4, and so on. 4 ga 2, sorry. And so this was providing lots of meaningful experiences to develop a knowledge of numbers in terms of their parts. Now, I don't think I'll have time to tell that wonderful story. Perhaps we can hold that for next year. But for those that might be interested in using the probe tasks to identify starting points for teaching, they can be found, as Chris referred to, in the Talking Number resources on the Northern Territory on this website. These resources include videos of the tasks being used by Yolngu educators and others. There's videos of the tasks being used in different community languages. There's progress maps, and quite detailed progress maps that take children from where they are to where they need to be in terms of school mathematics. And as I said, it's quite a valuable resource for those of you that are working in those communities. In conclusion, I've tried to focus on the need for teachers to focus on important mathematical ideas and the connections between them. In passing, I've mentioned the importance of identifying and building on what students already know, and I've illustrated that by referring to the big idea of trusting the count and how valued cultural knowledge came to be used in the purpose of learning about number in school mathematics. In my talk next year, I'll delve deeper into what this means and what it implies for how we teach mathematics in remote communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Di. While we're waiting for some more questions, you mentioned a story that you said you had to skip towards the end there. Can you tell us briefly what that was?
I would love to tell that story. It's a beautiful story. And if people can remember that second last slide, it had a picture of 2 lots of 4 trees. And this tells the story of, I was in a year 1 classroom at Shepherdson, and they were encouraging the young mothers and many of the aunties to come and just be in the classroom. It was pretty early in the year. And one young mother was sitting by herself at one of the small tables where the children, mostly 6-year-old, while they were seated on the mat. The class had just finished a summatising activity in which they were invited to say, how many dots there were on a series of flashcards. They were shown for about 2 seconds. The cards depicted collections from 0 to 10 dots in different ways. They could make dice patterns or card patterns. It could be 10 frames, could be random. And this was done as a whole class activity with the children responding orally. It was evident that nearly all the children could recognise composite collections up to 7, irrespective of the arrangements, but they had some difficulty with numbers larger or collections larger than that. As a consequence, the children, as the activity, were asked to draw a picture that told a story for 8 in terms of its parts. An example was given that involved 2 birds and 6 birds, and it was shown to the class and briefly described in Yolngu Mata by the Yolngu educator. The children all went back to their tables where paper and coloured pencils were all available, but at some point while they were still on the mat, one of the young women decided that she would start drawing a picture too, and by the time 3 of the children joined her at one of the tables, she was in deep concentration. So instead of her starting her own drawing, instead of the children starting their own drawing, they immediately and without instruction moved closer to the young woman to observe what she was doing. There was complete silence at this table, which was not the case elsewhere in the room, I can assure you. The young mother was very, very carefully drew 4 trees on one side of the page and 4 trees on the other, with various amounts of detail, but it was clear what she was doing. And when she'd sort of got more or less hinted at what she was doing, she said very quietly to herself, 4 ga 4. And She continued detailing the trees in a consistent and patterned way, completely oblivious to the little band of highly attentive observers. Still, the children did not pick up a pencil or move to do a drawing, despite the fact that other children in the room were already moving around, showing the teacher and the other adults in the room their pictures. When the young woman had completed most of the detail on 3 of the trees, she very carefully, indeed almost reverentially with 2 hands, she passed the paper to the child on her left with a nod and a gesture for him to complete it in the same manner. She then drew an identical picture without the detail and again reverentially placed this in front of the child to her right, all without speaking. And while she proceeded to engage in a different drawing, the remaining child, without any instruction to do so, started detailing the trees on the other side of the second child's drawing. At no point did the young mother make eye contact or speak to the children. To a conventionally trained teacher, this episode might be regarded as poor pedagogical practice. It was highly teacher-centred, involved little or no social interaction of any sort, at least to my eye. There was no room for error or risk-taking on the part of the children, and they were engaged in a repetitive process, not of their own creation. And yet they were utterly involved in the enterprise, even to the extent of quietly saying to themselves, "Forgar for," as they worked. This experience challenged my taken for granted views about best practice pedagogy and made me think absolutely again about value and purpose. That's my story.
That's lovely. That's a really fabulous story. Thank you for that. And we've just got time for a question that's come through. Have you used these activities to teach non-Indigenous children to understand the different cultural perspective and language used?
We haven't. We haven't done that in a systematic way. Working with a school, Rivergum Primary School down here in Melbourne some years back, we're working on the same big ideas, and trusting the count is just as important, of course, for everyone. They've got 63 different language groups in that school. There's large numbers of refugee children, for instance, many of whom coming from very traumatised backgrounds. And one of the things we did mention in that context is I took in the turtle eggs and I did tell the story, and that evoked some stories from their own cultures about the way numbers were seen and things. So we've not done it. That was just an opportunity that arose in that particular context. But it does leave itself open, I think, for a lot of application.
Agree, for sure. Okay, thanks, Di. And we've got over to you, Chris.
No worries. Thank you, Di. And I appreciate your efforts to keep it within 20 minutes. So thank you very much. Next speaker, I have the pleasure of introducing Nicole Boyd, who's currently at Queensland University of Technology, but she's also working up at Yirrkala at this point in time, or in the homeland schools, I should say, around Yirrkala. But Nicole's going to be talking about her previous work, and Nicole has been involved in remote education delivery in Eastern Adjumapja, and I didn't say that right, sorry, and Yawara. So I'll say that again. Amajida and Yawara speaking communities since 2014. In her current role as a teacher, as researcher, she has come to appreciate the unique position she is in. She has benefited from many opportunities for Indigenous cultural and ecological knowledge exchange through community-led teaching and learning experiences. Working together in the classroom and on country visits with assistant teacher Michelle Turner, she has been continually inspired to find innovative ways to remove barriers to student learning. Together, Nicole and Marcia have delivered unique both ways education experiences in mathematics. I will apologise for getting that bit of language wrong at the start, and I did practice with Nicole, but I will hand over to Nicole at this point in time to tell us all about her experiences in those communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Beautiful job with the introduction. It is the Utopia Eastern Amajara and Yawara, as you said, people whose voices I will be sharing with you today. A long story. I just wanted to start by mentioning that Chris Matthews and I actually met back in 2012 when I was working at Warrawa. I really like the Chris has developed this Gumpi pedagogical model, which I'm not referring to in this particular webinar, but which I will in the eventual presentation that we give down the track. So really, Chris is the conduit to this research, as well as some others. So thank you to Chris. Thank you to Di. Fascinating. Really, really pleased to see how you've woven all those experiences and really interesting ideas into your presentation. Loved it. So today, just a little bit on what I will be doing. I will be speaking to you about how we co-created opportunities to hear student voice on wild akajara harvest in order to create culturally inclusive middle years measurement curriculum and pedagogy practice. I will share with you my slide. That will be in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so firstly, before I begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the Gumachion Magda, whose land I come to today to share this research, investigating real-world contexts to explore the strand of measurement. I respectfully recognise past, present, emerging, and future leaders guiding the way forward in this shared intercultural space. I would also like to acknowledge the Utopia Eastern Amajara and Alyawara community who have shared the journey of the two-way teaching and learning approaches retold in this webinar. I would also like to highlight that this presentation contains Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, or ATSIMA, that belong to the Utopia Eastern Amajara and Alyawara community, including this image here of bush food. This is the dried desert raisin, or akajara. And I'd like you to consider this as you view other images that you will see in this webinar. So there'll be bush medicine, there'll be art, there'll be students, assistant teachers, and community engaged in two-way learning. The communities and the individual people have granted permission for me and QUT to present for you this information. They consent to the sharing of their ISIP. However, they ask that you do not use, copy, or deal with this without prior permission. And this information is provided in consultation with Terry Jenke and Charisma Cubelo in New South Wales. Hello to all you New South Wales people. There seems to be a lot of you. Just an outline of the presentation. Shout out to the one NT person as well, Yirkala School, you rock, and everyone who is tuning in from various states and time zones, etc., and the person overseas. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. You'll hear about me, my positioning, as Chris said, the community from which this study was based, the real world context, how I've gone about constructing new measurement knowledge with the students, and how the knowledge systems have come together. So, who am I? Here I am. A non-Indigenous middle years maths teacher in Alpara High School in the Central Desert region. As well as that, I am a member of the Ethno, STEM and Equity Research team at QUT, having pursued a master's there. And I have been looking at a particular question which is quite tricky for all you teachers out there. I'd like you to consider this. How does a non-Indigenous female or male secondary maths teacher integrate Indigenous perspectives on a traditional practice such as harvesting a kajara with middle years measurement learning? So I'd like the audience, the listeners, to consider how can STEM secondary teachers create the conditions to collaborate with members of a local Indigenous community, to facilitate students speaking about their interests in cultural knowledge, such as Akadja. What are the conditions that allow you as the educator to hear what it is that is said by students, and to allow this to inform the ways that together you construct measurement knowledge? So let's have a look at this journey that we are going on today. So this particular Indigenous community context is down this road. It's a long, sandy, dusty, quiet road. There's not many cars on it. And when you travel this road, you arrive in an ancient landscape where the Utopia, Eastern Amajara and Alyawada people use traditional harvesting practices such as their collection and small trade of wild Akadja. And they use this in order to teach the next generation of seed collectors just how important this knowledge is. Now, I'll just preface this by saying there is a lot that is already known about this particular plant. And you will hear just some of the knowledge around this. But it is this unique context and this perspective of a very remote Northern Territory high school that you will be hearing student voice and seeing how they co-construct new measurement understanding of wild Akadja harvest. So a real world context. Why this particular context? Why wild Akadja harvest? Well, it's important to listen to what has already been said by the people before you. And here you are about to hear from a linguist who has been in the Central Desert for over 20 years, working in many schools. And he and his wife have captured this beautifully in this quote, which is in Alyawada. Getting kids to school. It's important that they feel understood when they walk in the classroom, that they feel that teachers value and understand their way. So how does a non-Indigenous teacher do this? I come from Melbourne. I've lived in the desert and now I live in Yirrkala. I travel, I'm a visitor. It's not my country. But I have all of these Western concepts floating around in my head of how wonderful measurement learning can be. But I don't want to launch into a lesson if I don't think that it's going to have value. And so for me, that means going to the community where the students belong and asking them what information is valued, what local cultural knowledge is important. And for years, these Akadja harvesters have been collecting and selling this important dried fruit. However, not getting a lot of money in return for it. And it's really difficult to find. And so they have these bush harvester forums where they discuss what are the issues. And one of the issues they identified was intergenerational transfer of this knowledge. What are the young people doing at the moment and are they learning this stuff? And it turns out it's hard to get young 13, 14-year-old students involved in collecting Akadja. So we did it together. We co-created these measurement plans based on the interests and the aspirations of the Yawada community in Utopia and the Eastern Amajara people of Utopia. So, as I mentioned, there is a lot of knowledge around this plant. You can see the plant in the foreground, very spindly looking thing, and it contains this fruit. And when country is burnt, it gives an opportunity for this plant to grow. Without that burning, the plant is suffocated by the overgrowth of plants such as spinifex. So in order for this two-way learning to occur. A non-Indigenous teacher alongside the staff who work at the school and the students visited country at a time when a kajara was growing, collected in 1 hour 2.6 kilograms of dried kajara fruit, which then gave a context to do all sorts of learning around maths back in the classroom with that dried kajara. So there is 10 weeks of curriculum just there with that very plant. Having access to that plant, as I mentioned, it's quite difficult to find, so it's very much a seasonal, depends on seasonal rains as to when you can collect it. So here's a handful of the desert raisin, the kajara, and you can see just how dried up it is in that image. So we know where to find it over time. If you live in a community and you work in a community, you learn these things as a non-Indigenous teacher. But what's the next step? Where are we going with our measurement curriculum? We've got 14, 15-year-olds who are possibly going to leave school very soon. What can we offer them in a central desert region? So we started to ask local elders what their thoughts were, and here is one of the voices of a community member who's giving permission for us to visit a particular site where a kajara is known to grow.
And I know the good place is my mother's country, Anangara, where a lot of kajara grow. It's a good place we can go.
Okay, so this is the place she identified is a good place to go. This is her mother's country. So in yarning circles, it was important not only to identify a significant a kajara site to take students to, but it was just as important to work out who should be there at the time that we visit, in order that the right questions are being asked by the right people at the right time, where those two knowledge systems come together and intersect. So as a non-Indigenous woman, I represent that fresh water that Chris was talking about. How do I integrate Indigenous knowledge on a kajara into a measurement lesson while out on country? Again, this is country I don't know. I don't know where to stand, where to sit, where to move, how to move. All of these things are not known to me. So it's important that I ask the right people before I begin with a measurement lesson. So not only have we established where to go, we now needed to establish what kind of knowledge concepts were appropriate to discuss while on country and to learn about. So students identified from this concept map things that interested them were things like burning country, the rainfall, where the water places are, the names of plants, and the harvesting protocols around who's allowed to harvest and when, and all of that. So using this concept map allowed students to first identify their interests and then turn that into an interview question so that they could speak directly on country with the elders who were at the site here that was identified as an important site. So here's an opportunity for you to hear what it sounds like when a student is learning about their interests while yarning.
Should we spend this land here?
Okay, so this student has asked about burning land. She's nervous, she's giggling, she's laughing. That's natural. That's part of stepping up into a role of a communicator of knowledge that interests her. And she's supported by all of these people around her who were there for her to discover this for herself. And further to that, we have dialogue on some of the other knowledge concepts identified as of interest to students. So this image, before I play the recording, the image demonstrates something else. This is about the student demonstrating immense respect for the person who is sharing that information with her. So that is part of her substantive conversation that she is having with that elder. Not only has she got a question to ask, but she needs to demonstrate respect in how she receives that information. So here's an excerpt of some of that information which is spoken about in Eastern Amajara. Oops, sorry. So this lady has spoken directly, giving ideas to the students about how she is to behave while she is on country. So it's very detailed, very explicit. You're not allowed, you may have heard the word not allowed, and I'm not allowed to go a particular way while you're on country. You must respect the way you act while on country by not wandering all over the place, by sticking together and only in the places that you've been told you're allowed to go. So that's an important part of the condition for allowing students to speak and to listen to their interests, is getting the right people there, having them speak about how to act while they're there. And that then allowed us to start to integrate that freshwater or Western perspective about management of country while we're at the site. So here you see myself beside Marcia, who I worked with for 2 years in this particular classroom and in many bush trip opportunities like this one. So we've already developed a really strong relationship of how we work together with the students and how we continually cross over between the home-based language and cultural content and the school-based language and cultural content. So setting up this Transact study so that students could learn about sustainably managing this resource was something that was easy for her and I to do because we had that relationship already. So she identified this as the place to go, and away we go. 50-metre Transact length is stretched out across country. Students conduct a randomised experiment. They identify a quadrant point. They locate that quadrant point on the Transact line, place it there, and then take an estimate of the vegetation cover within that quadrant, within 1 square metre. So that is how we created the conditions for this new measurement knowledge to be constructed by the students. So here's me demonstrating, this is where you record that information. This is the symbols and the grids and the references that we use in order to record the measurement curriculum concepts around vegetation cover as a percentage of that square metre within that quadrant. So that then gives us the opportunity, we create an opportunity for students to traverse between their home-based language and culture and the school-based language and culture. And here is a sample of what that sounds like between the teacher and myself. Oh, sorry, the student and myself.
Okay, and looking back here, what percentage cover have we got at quadrant point 45?
Kajra?
No.
No. So what are you going to put? Yeah.
And again, we're using multiple representations to traverse between those language and cultures represented by those two knowledge systems. So we've got vegetation cover at quadrant point 45. We've got percentage. We've already considered a similar situation in the classroom where a student can draw a square and within that square cover it in colour and then identify the proportion of that colour that is red or green or blue and convert between percentage and decimal and fraction within a square in a classroom context. Now we're out on country and we've got a square and we are doing the same thing. We are looking at that proportional reasoning and estimating that percentage cover. So I know because the student and I have done a lot of work prior to this point that she is comfortable with identifying the percentage cover. But I also know that she knows what that plant looks like. And if she was to see that plant in the quadrant, she would know that it's there. So simply pointing to the quadrant, tapping on it, and asking her any kajara, she answers emphatically no. She knows there's nothing there. I know she knows there's nothing there. It's simply an opportunity to reinforce that with the language that's required for measurement curriculum. So there are numerous ways you can do this. Another way is looking at a cultural production of bush medicine. So again, applying proportional reasoning by looking at a object that the students are really familiar with. They know how to create bush medicine through crushing it, through boiling it on a fire, straining it off, sieving out the plants and collecting that bush medicine. But what they don't know is how to give a price that is suitable for each of these containers that were brought into the classroom. So it's an opportunity to discuss with students what is a suitable price. How much do you think they should sell the bush medicine for? And given that this bush medicine is being sold to their community members, they want it to be reasonably priced. They want an old lady who can't necessarily access this bush medicine and make it for herself. They want her to be able to buy it. So some might say, oh, that's $4, or that's $12, or that's $20. But then using the maths, we were able to extract, well, what is a reasonable price per meal? And similarly with art, so we have an opportunity to look at something students are really familiar with. This student is looking at a canvas that belongs to her sister, and she's in a classroom with her mother. And her mother is guiding her in how it is that she needs to treat that canvas and the fact that she is even allowed to talk about that canvas and what those images refer to that are on that canvas. So if you show young people that painting, they recognise what it is. It's wildflowers, it's bush medicine, it's the leaves. But if you ask what price you should sell that canvas for, well, that depends who your audience is. If you're on Todd Mall in Alice Springs, you might want a little bit of money and you could sell it for $15. But if you're in a gallery and you know this artist and the rate that is expected for this particular artist within this gallery, then you can assign a price that is representing the value of that art and the work that's gone into it and that cultural knowledge. So students extracted the rate of 14 cents per square centimetre for this particular artist and applied it to the measurement of length times width, and then rounded off the price to come up with the price tag to then sell art to members of the Alice Springs community who came to a pop-up shop. So I've kind of lost track of time, so I think I need to wind it up. I want to leave you with this thought that this curriculum that I've shared with you today is shaped by my narrative. So in order for you to access different ways of bringing cultural knowledge into the classroom and crossing between those two knowledge systems, you really need to think about your own personal resources. What do you have available to you? And for me, that road and that community was an immense resource available to me. And 40 individual members had come to myself and my husband and asked us to organise bush trips so that we could continue this intergenerational transfer of knowledge in this unique context. So that was a really valuable experience. But I also have my own ideas and beliefs around sustainable land management, which led me to want to be out on country doing land management maths practices. And also I have an understanding of how art and bush medicine can be used inappropriately and sold at prices that aren't representative of their value. So that's why I wanted to instill this use of maths to identify what is appropriate to sell these particular artefacts for. And also I have my own story, my own life experience, which is that if I'm in a classroom and I feel like things are stopping me from learning, then I know what it feels like to be trapped. And I want to remove those trappings so that students can push through and find their way forward in a world that really does appreciate and honour all of their strengths that they have from their own culture. So why do we do this? Ni wangana, ni ja miri yangana. You speak with students, assistant teachers, community members, and they tell you what they want in a classroom, then you collectively create it. And the reason you do that is because you want a culturally safe and equitable measurement education provision for students. Colour. Finished.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I will just hand over to Katie now to curate the question, Q&As. They look like they're coming in, which is good.
Yep, thanks, Chris. Nicole. So Nicole, we have a question here from an early careers person teaching high school maths. She said, asked, what tips would you give to help me and others implement effective and respectful learning opportunities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners, such as activities, resources, places we can learn more, etc. And thank you for your time and knowledge. So,
look, you're welcome. It really just starts with context. So where are you? Sorry, I've got to find my picture. Oh no, I've lost you. Can you still hear me? Sorry, I'm
yes, we can hear you, Nicole. Yep, and okay, now we can see you.
Yeah, you can see me. Great. Okay, so really, it comes down to context. Are you in a city? Are you in a regional area? Are you? Do you have access to Indigenous community consultative bodies? Because there are many, and that they are usually the best place to start. So for instance, when I used to work at Warrawa, Ani Lois Pila was part of a Aboriginal collective, and they were often advising on curriculum that's relevant to that particular area or region. So yeah, it's no one-stop shop. You really just need to ask, and if you find someone who wants to share something with you, just really value that information and respect it, and don't presume because somebody shared it with you that it's okay to then copy it and reproduce it and use it in the classroom. But it's better to invite someone into a classroom and do that together if that's possible. I hope that answers your question.
And Nicole, last one, and then I've just got another message to you from somebody else. If we have no Indigenous students in our classroom, I would think it's still important to introduce Indigenous content to celebrate our country's culture. Is this correct from your perspective? If so, how do you do that in a respectful and meaningful way? Similar to your last question.
Yeah, great question, great question. I think a lot of people want to honour Indigenous culture and knowledge in particular ways on important dates and, you know, Reconciliation Week or whatnot. And I think that it needs to be ongoing and it needs to be updated and it needs to be embedded, really. And that's why it's a priority in the Australian curriculum. So if you look at science elaborations, then you'll find, Katie, you probably know this, you've probably written it, that there's a lot of content, isn't there, that is easily accessible. And so that's probably the best way to do it, because it helps to break down those stereotypes about what cultural knowledge is and when it's appropriate to use it, etc. So use it always and use it as the curriculum has already set it up to be used. And it's wonderful that you can actually get a piece of the desert in some of those science elaborations, because some really clever people have gone about and videoed some of their lessons and included that in the Kara. So I recommend that you dig around there. It's a good place to start. And well done, great question, because it's everyone's responsibility to be mindful of this and embed it in classrooms.
Thanks, Nicole, and great answer. there's so much there, and you know, in that teacher background information as well for every one of those science elaborations, there's so much maths, which, you know, Chris and I are working through at the moment. Then we just have one request from Gabrielle saying, absolutely amazing. It would be awesome to mathematically code this plant. Are you interested in having a yarn of this idea, Nicole? And if you are, we can pass on the information. And I'd love to be part of that conversation too. So,
yeah, look, definitely let's keep the conversation going, because it's just a starting point. That's what I felt like with all of these projects, is that the more open you are, the more involved and interesting these lessons can become. So if you want to look at Fibonacci, or you want to look at some other way of understanding rate and proportional reasoning, that you can do that once you're open to it. But this plant is very rare. So you need to kind of be invited on country to have a share in that. Otherwise, big shout out to Raylene Brown. If you're ever at Kungas Can Cook in Alice Springs, she actually does catering based on bush food. She is amazing, amazing, amazing woman.
Yeah. She is, yeah. Thanks, Nicole. And so we'll put you in touch with Gabrielle and with us, with ATSIMA as well, if that's okay, Chris. And over to you, Chris. Thank you so much.
Yeah, look, I've got the responsibility of finishing off the session. So I'd like to start by thanking our presenters, and I can hear the applause already from over the Zoom. So I want to thank you both, Nicole and Di. Particularly because we did put quite strict time limits around your talks, and you did fantastic jobs in trying to keep within those limits. And I know it's not a difficult thing, not an easy thing to do, because I like to be quite verbose myself. So thank you for keeping within those limits, and thank you for your engaging conversations, and also, you know, looking at both of them, you can see that ebb and flow between salt water and fresh water, which is beautiful, and in relationship to each other. I think what I do also like about it is that coming to know as well, as both non-Indigenous people, that coming to know the context and the space, and the lessons and the opportunities that you presented were awesome within that. So thank you. I'd like to say too is that these things don't happen, you know, overnight. There's heaps and heaps of planning, meetings, test runs, and all sorts of things to make it run smoothly. So I'd like to thank everyone involved, Nicole, Di, Kirsty, Katie, and also Melinda, who also do an awesome job to make sure that these things run smoothly. And in saying that, our next one, so if you want to get a pad and pen to write this down, the next date is going to be the 17th of November, and the timing will be announced later on. We're still playing around with timing of things, so any feedback you gave us through the web, through the chat, will be appreciated. So we'll advertise that through a ATSIMA website. And I'm really pleased that we're getting about 100 plus participants at a time, and it really shows a keen interest in understanding more within this space. So I'm really pleased with that. So 17th of November again, the timing will come through the ATSIMA website. If you're not a member, it's free to join. We just want to get people on board and also demonstrate that people are interested in what we are doing and what we're trying to achieve through ATSIMA. So if you join as a member, you will get those notifications automatically. So on the 17th of November 2020, we have two presenters. It's Amber Hughes from University of Newcastle, and she'll be presenting a policy discourse and analysis around education policy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and in particular looking at how equity is defined within that discourse. The other person we got presenting is Rowena Ball from the Australian National University. Rowena is actually an Indigenous mathematician. She's done her life studying mathematics, not as a maths educator, but she's been working a lot with communities, and she wants to talk about maths on country. So they sound like two excellent talks that you cannot miss, I'm sure. So please join us on the 17th of November 2020. And I think if anybody else doesn't want to say anything before we leave, I will, no, everyone's shaking their head, I think.
Chris, just one thing. So some people in Queensland were late because you fellas are half an hour behind and an hour behind or whatever. Did you mention that the webinar will be on our website?
No, I didn't. Yeah, so we are recording all the webinars, and they will go on our website, so you can actually see them on there. Also, I'd like to issue an apology to Nicole, because I actually connected her to the wrong community, but the communities that were mentioned to here today were the ones that she worked in, so my apologies for that last time.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so go to recordings, have a look at them, and please keep the 17th of November in mind for our next seminar. Also, I didn't mention too that Di and Nicole mentioned about presenting next year. We're still looking into how we might run with our conference, our 2020 conference at Yirrkala, where we might have a version of that. There's still things that need to be sorted out, but that will be announced again through our website. So it's imperative you become a member. Anyway, so thank you again for your attendance. I'll call this at an end. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.